In this video, we're looking at the top 10 weirdest islands of the United Kingdom. We're looking for the most weird, the most bizarre, the most odd, and the most inbred islands. And the most remote, the most obscure islands are so deserted, why would anyone live there? So, before we can start this top 10, we have some honourable mentions. Now, this top 10 list only includes inhabited islands. It has to have residents, which means there's several interesting islands that didn't make it to the list, such as the islands of Fort Hoo and Fort Darnett. These are uninhabited islands in the middle of the River Medway with historic wartime forts on them. And once I brought a boat, I drove my boat out to them to have a look, and they are very interesting and very weird islands. So make sure you check out that video. Now we've got some more honourable mentions because this list only includes islands that are still islands. Now there's two islands worth mentioning about which are very weird places, are no longer islands. They've now been infilled with land, so they're now connected to the mainland again. So these are the Isle of Grain. The Isle of Grain is located in Medway, Kent, and it is a very remote place. It's at the end of a long road. A road so boring that everyone used to drive down it really fast just to get to the other end of it because it was so dull. And there was lots and lots of car crashes. So many that they had to install average speed cameras. And in the village of Grain, nothing ever happens. It is a remote little place where just one co-op supermarket, one road going to it, no train connection, and there is a bus every hour, but it's a Viva and very overpriced. And there's nothing to do there. Everyone just sits around in their houses, bored out of their mind, taking drugs. It's a very bizarre place. Although, if you want to visit the Isle of Grain, it's very interesting for wartime history, because there's a lot of wartime history around the island, such as Grain Sea Fort. You can only get to this fort when the tide is low, as there's a little walkway out to it, and it's a very interesting place to explore. So the Isle of Grain is well worth a visit. The Isle of Grain also has an airport, and the airport has a curved runway. The runway is bent. How? Although it isn't really a proper airport, it's just a grass runway for landing little tiny planes, and the runway is only 1/4 of a mile long. So, the next honourable mention is... Now, sadly, I can't include it on this top 10 list because the island is now permanently connected to the mainland, which is such a shame because it's such a weird island. On this island, the locals are very weird, and there's a big phobia of the word rabbit. You must never say the word rabbit when you're on Portland because the locals go crazy. Although, in the modern day, this is over-exaggerated to the locals as a means of providing tourism to the island. It's like a local tradition thing around the island. And this means that not even advertisements on the billboards in the island can have the word rabbit. So, on the film Wallace and Gromit and the Were-Rabbit, the advert for the film for the billboard in Portland had to be modified to not include the word rabbit. That is how obsessed they are here. Also, the island has a very weird beach. It's several miles long, and the size of the stones on the beach changes from one end to the other. So one end has great big stones, the other end has tiny little pebbles. And if you moor up your boat at a beach and don't know how far along you are, you simply look at the size of the stones to judge how far you are along the beach. Interesting geological oddity. So, that's the honourable mentions done. Let's now get on with the top 10 weirdest islands. To judge the islands in this video, I'm looking at 5 different factors, which are unusualness. Does the island have an unusual feel? Does it have a weird feeling to it? Does it have an unusual character? How different is it to the mainland? Then there's transport, or should I say, lack of transport, because the harder the island is to get to, the weirder the island is. Lack of transport and weirdness go hand in hand with each other. Then there's supermarkets, or should I say, lack of supermarkets, because if an island doesn't have the usual supermarkets, that is a clear sign of weirdness. Then there is people. How weird are the people? Because some islands, the people are thoroughly inbred. Then there is remoteness. The longer it takes to get to the island, the weirder the island is. And does the island lack basic facilities? So these are things I'm judging them on. Let's go. And at number 10 is the Isle of Sheppy in Kent. And this place is known for being weird. It is a very bizarre place where the people are totally, utterly inbred. It is famous for it. The people are so weird and very chav. And there's literally so inbred there. Now, Sheppy isn't as weird as it used to be because the new road bridge is built. Before this bridge was built, the only way on and off the island was the old lifting bridge, and in the past, this bridge used to spend a lot of its time raised and would often only lower when a train was due. This meant that you could only drive on and off the island at the same time a train was due to go on and off the island, and the rest of the time you were simply trapped. And there used to be long queues for bridge, lots of delays, and it made the island feel very disconnected from the mainland. And the railway wasn't even the main line. There's no direct trains to London. A railway is just a branch line, making the island feel very disconnected indeed. But since the new road bridge is now built, the island is now more connected, and as it's more connected, that in turn means, sadly, the island is now less weird. The other things we're going to discuss on each island for how remote it is transport and supermarkets. So with supermarkets, Sheppy does have the full range of normal supermarkets. So it's not as weird as the others, which is why it's only number 10. Now we go on to number 9, which is the Isle of Man. Now the Isle of Man is a self-governing island. It technically counts as a sovereign state if you look at a Wikipedia list of sovereign states, but it is still owned by the United Kingdom. So I'm still including it in the list anyway. There are no road bridges from the Isle of Man to the mainland, meaning the only way to get there is either by ferry or by aeroplane. The Isle of Man is a very sleepy little island. Not that much really happens there. It's got a little historic railway where everything goes slow. It's a very slow-paced little island. Apart from once a year, there is the most crazy over-the-top motorbike race. Motorbikes race down the island at a speed and get up to speeds of 180 miles an hour. It's just crazy that health and safety would allow a race so dangerous. Also considering every year several people get killed participating in this race. So how does health and safety allow such a race to go ahead? And the answer to that is because it's an island. The weirdness of an island means weird things happen that you'd never get on the mainland. As for supermarkets and transportation, it does have the usual range of supermarkets, and it does have an airport. The runway is a mile long, so you can't land a Ryanair 737, but EasyJet, as well as having Airbus A321s and A320s, also has a few A319s, and that is specifically for smaller runways, such as the Isle of Man. So the Isle of Man does have EasyJet flights, meaning it is fairly well connected, and because it's well connected, in turn, it's not that weird of a place, which is why it's only number 9 on the list. Now we move on to number 8, which is St Michael's Mount. Now there is a handful of permanent residents living on the island, meaning it can be included on my list. St Michael's Mount is owned by the National Trust, who only look at history through rose-tinted spectacles and only look at history in a nice, happy, cosy, unrealistic way. But what makes St Michael's Mount interesting is you can only walk to it at low tide. At high tide, you have to get a boat, which means if you only want to walk there, you have to plan your trip accordingly. And alternatively, if you don't want to walk through the sand and only want to get a boat, you also have to plan your trip accordingly. On St Michael's Mount, there is a funicular, but this funicular is not for passengers, it's only for goods. And as for supermarkets, there are no supermarkets on the island. There's only overpriced cafes. But this is not a remote island, it's not far from land, and supermarkets are not far away. But it's still very interesting. And now, number 7, Guernsey. Guernsey is one of the Channel Islands. Again, these are self-governing islands, sovereign states, but are still owned by the United Kingdom. I've included Guernsey on the list, but not Jersey. Jersey is the bigger of the Channel Isles, and it's not that weird at all because it does have EasyJet flights. It's got a 1 mile long runway, meaning that EasyJet can land their A319s on it. And it's got quite a lot of tourists, and a lot of people visit there, and the more people that visit a place, the less weird it is. But Guernsey, on the other hand, is the lesser known of the 2 main Channel Isles, meaning it's more weird. It also has an airport with a mile-long runway, so EasyJet could land their A319s on it if they wanted to, but they don't. There are other crappy little companies that do flights, but as there's no mainstream companies doing flights, it makes the island more disconnected. Another thing about Guernsey is the speed limits. In towns, 25 miles an hour, and in the countryside, 35 miles an hour. What a weird speed limit system. Another weird thing about Guernsey is the money. Even though they just take ordinary English money, when you pay for stuff, when you get change back, when you'd expect to have a pound coin change, instead they give you a pound note. What is a pound note? These pound notes can only be used in Guernsey. So if you're given a pound note as change, you then have to go and spend it there, meaning you have to spend more money on the island. It is very weird. We'll be coming back to the Channel Isles later on in this top 10. As for now, we now move on to number 6, which is Orkney. This is a group of little islands above Scotland. And now if you think that the north of Scotland is very, very remote, the travel times it takes to get out right to the northern part of Scotland is long, very long. And as the more disconnected the place is, the weirder it gets. So the whole of the top of Scotland is a very weird place. People talk with very strong Scottish accents to a point where they're very hard to understand. Not much happens, it rains all the time, and it's very weird. But if you go even beyond the top of Scotland and go out to the islands, it gets even weirder. The Orkney Islands are a weird group of islands that want to become independent to Scotland. Screw Scottish independence, they want Orkney independence. It's very weird, and just like most of the islands on this list, there is no road bridges to get to Orkney. The only way to get there is by boat or by aeroplane. There's also airports on the island, but all these airports are tiny. The biggest airport with the longest runway has a 3/4 of a mile runway. So it does have some very little tiny aeroplanes, very overpriced, costing well over £100 for a single ticket. So these are tiny expensive planes, but you can't even get an aeroplane to London. That's right, you actually cannot take an aeroplane straight from Orkney to London, making it so remote. So if you want to go there, you first have to get a train up to Scotland before you can then take your aeroplane to get to the island. Very remote indeed. And as for supermarkets, the Orkney Islands do have a few big name supermarkets, so food isn't too expensive there. And all of the people on Orkney are thoroughly inbred. I mean, the north of Scotland is all quite inbred anyway, but once you get right up to the islands, they are very inbred. And number 5 is Shetland Islands. Now, everything I said that was weird about Orkney Islands is even more so and more exaggeratedly weird on Shetland, because Shetland Islands are very similar to Orkney, apart from they're even further away from the mainland and the airports are even smaller. Again, there's no direct flights to London. You can only travel to Scotland from Shetland Islands, so it's very, very remote indeed. Although there are still mainstream supermarkets there, so food is luckily not too expensive there. As Shetland Islands are so far north, they are freezing cold, it's almost never sunny there, and it rains all the time, if not snows all the time. And just like Orkney, the people of the Shetland Islands are also thoroughly inbred. And now, number 4. And for number 4, we go back to the Channel Islands. And number 4 is Sark, an island where there is no cars. You cannot bring any motor vehicles to the island. Sark is next to Guernsey Island and is incredibly remote. There are no supermarkets on the island at all, just a couple of little tiny overpriced shops to buy things, so you're going to have to spend a lot more money for food if you visit there. And as there's no cars and there's no airport, the only way to get there is to travel to Guernsey, then get a boat from Guernsey to Sark, making it a very remote place. It is an island off of an island. That sums up why it is so weird. So then, number 3, which is Lindisfarne. Lindisfarne is a weird but very interesting island. It's very remote and has quite an unusual feel to it. Mainly it's just tourists that visit here because it's a very touristy island with lots of ancient sites on it. There are a handful of houses on it and a few people actually live there. And to live on such a remote, weird island, you have to be a bit of an odd person. Now on Lindisfarne, unlike a lot of the islands I've mentioned so far, you can actually drive there. But only when the tide is out. When the tide comes in, the causeway is flooded. Now, loads of tourists like to come to Lindisfarne, and they often come by car, and a lot of them get caught out because the tide comes in, and then they're trapped on the island. There are also boats going there. None of these boats are able to take cars. They're just like little tiny passenger boats, and that's not much use if your car is trapped on the island. Also, there are no supermarkets. I couldn't actually see any shops at all. And even over on the mainland, there's no supermarkets anywhere nearby. So if you live on this island, how would you get your food? It really is a remote, little, tiny, weird island. And now, number 2, which is the Isle of Wight. Now, I was in a big debate whether Isle of Wight should be number 1 or number 2, but I've now decided number 2. The Isle of Wight is a fascinating island, the most interesting of all the islands in the United Kingdom. You can get there either by car ferry, costing £80 a return ticket by car. It is the world's most expensive car ferry for the distance it goes. It only travels 3 or 4 miles, but it's so overpriced. It is an utter rip-off. You can also take passenger ferry from Portsmouth over to Ryde Pierhead, and you can also take hovercraft. Very interesting, it actually has hovercrafts going to it. I think it's more of a tourist thing. They are very expensive, but they are very fast. Also going from Portsmouth over to Ryde Beach. On the Isle of Wight, the most famous thing is, of course, the 1938 trains. These trains are second-hand from London Underground. They previously used to be 1923 trains here. The reason why they used London Underground trains is because the tunnel at Ryde is low height, and the only trains they could fit through the tunnel are underground trains. So for ages they had London Underground 1923 trains. In 1992, these were then replaced with the 1938 trains, which are here today, which have ran 82 years of service. That is impressive. Although last time I went here, I went on 1938 trains. They are in a really bad condition. The suspension feels really bad. They're not getting to top speed anymore. And the whole thing feels like it's falling apart because no money's been spent on this railway at all. And the 1938 trains are going to be replaced very soon. Rumour has it they're being replaced with D trains. But how do you fit a D train through the tunnel? Does that mean the tunnel's having to be dug out deeper to fit a D train? I don't know. Or as well as all of this, the Isle of Wight has a lot of interesting things around it. There's just lots of stuff to see with, whether it's abandoned buildings, historic sites, or just all sorts of stuff. Like over at the other end of the island at the Needles, there is a cable car lift that you can ride. And as for connections to the mainland as well as the ferries, there is an airport, but it's got a tiny little runway. And it does have some commercial flights, but only very overpriced ones. It doesn't have any mainstream commercial flights. And as for price of food, the Isle of Wight has the regular supermarkets, but these often lack the discounts of the mainland. Because when you see an advert for a discount in a major supermarket, it usually says small print at the bottom, not valid in the Isle of Wight. Also, on the Isle of Wight, the people are very weird. There's only 2 types of people on the Isle of Wight, tourists and locals. And the locals are thoroughly inbred. As it takes a bit of time to get to the mainland, most locals don't go to the mainland that often. In fact, they refer to the mainland as England, as if the Isle of Wight's not part of England. So they do act like it's their own little culture, and they are very, very inbred. The Isle of Wight is a thoroughly weird place, but absolutely worth visiting. It is so interesting there. So then, number 1, the weirdest island in the United Kingdom, which is the Scilly Isles. The Scilly Isles are 28 miles west of Cornwall, and the far tip of Cornwall over Penzance and Land's End is a very weird remote place. It is so remote and feels like you're disconnected from everywhere. It's like a little nowhere land at the end of Cornwall. But if you think the end of Cornwall is weird and deserted and very remote, that's nothing compared to the Scilly Isles. The level of remoteness on these islands is just extreme. The only people that live here are people that want to be left alone. People that want to be disconnected and pretend the rest of the world doesn't exist. They are so weird. And what's even weirder is the lack of transport links. Now, there is an airport on the Scilly Isles, and it's got a 0.4 mile long runway. So it has very, very small planes, and these planes run just to the mainland. The furthest you can travel by airplane from the Scilly Isles is Exeter. You can't even travel to London. That's right, if you want to get to the Scilly Isles, you can't simply get on a plane from London there. You have to travel before you can even board your flight there. And the flights are very overpriced. A single ticket from Exeter to the Scilly Isles costs £180. Now, there is also a ferry there. And the ferry is mainly just a passenger ferry. It can only take, from what I remember, just 2 cars, and the cars don't even drive on. If you want to take your car to the Scilly Isles, well, you can't take your car if you're just a visitor. You can only take your car to the Scilly Isles if you're a permanent resident there. And if you want to take your car on a boat, it has to be lifted onto the goods area of the boat. It has to be lifted into the goods bay by a crane. You can't drive on. A crane has to lift your car up and put it in the goods bay. You can only take your car over as a permanent import to the Scilly Isles. You can't just travel backwards and forwards with a car. So once your car's on the Scilly Isles, you cannot realistically put it on a ferry and take it backwards and forwards between the mainland. So whatever island you put your car on, the car is then effectively trapped. You can't even drive between the islands. And that's the longest island, it's 2 miles long. If you put your car on that island, the longest you can travel on it is literally just 2 miles up and back on the island. And that's at such a short distance. Why would you even bother having a car for that? Well, I actually don't know, but all of the people on the Scilly Isles all have cars. And by cars, I don't just mean old bangers, I mean actual reasonable cars. And some people even have expensive cars. It's like the cars you see are no different to what you'd see in London. Yet, you can't drive them anywhere. You can't even get a car into 5th gear. So I really don't get why everyone has cars. So strange. And now, supermarkets. On the Scilly Isles, there's only one actual supermarket. There's a couple of other little crappy shops, but there's only one actual supermarket, which is a small little co-op. And co-ops are quite expensive anyway, but this one on the Scilly Isles is mega expensive. So if you're going to live here, the price of food is high. So, the reason why the Scilly Isles are number 1 on my top 10 weirdest islands in the UK is because of how weirdly remote they are and how odd everyone is, living in their weird little fantasy land on these islands, completely disconnected from real life in the rest of the world. In fact, the people here act like the rest of the world just doesn't exist. They like to live in their remote little bubble away from everywhere else, driving a fairly reasonable cars, in some cases even have expensive cars around the island like it's an all-day place, despite the fact the longest distance they can actually drive is 2 miles at most. And it is literally a weird other world, and that's why it's number 1. It's so utterly remote and the people are so weird, and obviously little islands, these people are very, very inbred. So that's the end of the video. Leave a comment in the comment section. Which islands do you think are the weirdest? Do you agree with me, or is there some other island that you think's weird? And also, have I inspired you to visit any of these islands? Because remember, when travelling, weird is good. The weirder somewhere is, the more rewarding it is to travel there. Good idea,